This is Django Riffs, a podcast for learning web application development in Python using the Django web framework. We explore all of Django's features to equip you with the knowledge to build your own web app. I'm your host, Matt Lehman. Episode 4, Building User Interfaces. Hi, welcome to another episode of Django Riffs. And in this episode, we're going to talk about templates. Last time, we discussed views and dealing with requests and providing responses, but the responses that we provided from those views were pretty dull, frankly. They weren't representative of a lot of real responses that you'll use commonly in applications. And so this time we're going to talk about producing some real responses that people would actually care about. And templates are the way that we do that. Templates help you build your user interface. So we're going to dive into those and talk about all the details of setting up templates, understanding what templates do for you, understanding features that are available from Django, and all of that. Let's start with the setup. Like everything else in Django, your settings for templates are going to be found in your settings.py file. If you use the start project command to generate your project, you'll have a templates section already put in place for you. And it is functional out of the box. There are applications in Django that use it, and we're going to tweak it so that it will be useful for our purposes for our projects. First, let me start by describing that section and outlining each of the elements that are in that settings. So if you open up a project settings file, you'll find a variable that is all capitalized called templates, and it's a list. And in that list is going to be a dictionary, and the dictionary has a variety of options in it that are specified as keys, and there are the different settings that control different aspects of the template system. The first thing you might see is a backend. Django has multiple different template backends, but for the purpose of this episode, we're going to focus on the Django built-in template system. The other one that comes with Django is Jinja 2, and it's available as an option, but I think that the ecosystem has a much stronger support for the Django template system, so we're going to focus on that. The second attribute of the settings is something called DIRs, that's D-I-R-S, so it's referring to directories that you want to inform Django to look for additional template files, and we'll take more focus on that in just a minute. There is a key called app.dirs, and what that's telling Django is that the templates engine should look in a certain directory within each application for any additional template files. For the Django template system, in a Django app, it's going to look for a directory called templates and add that to its discovery mechanism. And then finally, there's a key called options, which provides additional options that are pertinent to whatever template system you choose to use. And the default list that comes with the start project command is a set of context processors. We'll discuss context processors more a little later. As we dig in more, we need to consider where our templates are going to be. And first, we need to even understand what templates are. Templates are static files, and they will be used by the Django system to be combined with dynamic data that you have within your application. So those files need a home to live in. And we need to think about where that can go. As I mentioned earlier, there's the app.dirs option, which will find template files within an application, but there's also the option of providing more directory locations to look for templates. And I think there's a bit of a divide perhaps in the community on where do I put my templates. There's a camp within the community that says templates should probably go within the applications themselves. Keeping templates within an application directory is useful for reusable application and is one of the main mechanisms that get used when applications are shared across projects and open source applications are made available. It's how the Django extension ecosystem works primarily. So that is a very useful mechanism for that kind of system. But the other camp within the Django community says that your template should be for your project. So you should have a separate templates directory that is sort of globally available for your entire project. I happen to fall into that latter group of people. I think that it's most useful to see all of my templates in a single place. So in order to do that, we need to modify that DIRS option that was in the template settings. The DIRS option accepts a list, and that list is a list of paths to look for templates. In your project settings file, you can modify that list and use the base dir option that is provided at the top of the Start Project settings. That's referring to what it sounds like, the base directory for the whole project. And so it's something that we can use to inform Django of other locations. So by using base dir in combination with os.path.join, we can say os.path.join, base dir as the first argument, and the string of templates as the second argument. And that gives us a new place for the Django template system to look for template files. And we can put all of our project structure in that templates directory and keep all of our user interface that we build in a single place so that whenever you're looking for something in your project, you know exactly the place to look for it. Those are the primary settings for templates. There are more options that you can consider, more things that you can discover about the settings, but those are the basics that will get you going and give you an understanding of what is that section when you look in that settings.py file. Now let's talk about actually using the template system. And the primary way that we use that is with something called render. Render is it's a concept, I guess, but it is also a function within Django. But the idea behind rendering is taking a Django template, a static file, and a set of data called context, normally, and combining those two things and producing an output. Let's look at an example to see what that looks like. If we have an applications views.py file, we can import from Django.shortcuts, import render. And we have a view. It's a function-based view. I'm calling it a template view. It takes a request object as the input. And on the first line of this view, I'm creating a dictionary. I'm calling it context, and the key is first name, and the value is Johnny. Finally, in this view, we're going to call render with request as the first argument, a string of hello.html as the second argument, and that context variable, that context dictionary that we just created, as the third argument. What is render going to do? Render is going to run the template engine. It's going to look for a template named hello.html. It's going to find that file, take your context, and combine them together. It's that combination part that's the tricky part to understand. There's a lot of things that happen under the covers to make that work, but essentially you can think about context as being the bag of variables that get added to a template. So if our template was to look like an h1 HTML header tag with a starting value of our starting string of hello, then we can also add in the context data dynamically. And the way to do that is with curly braces. So we start with two open curly braces, and we say first name, which matches the key from our dictionary, our context dictionary, and then we close it with two curly braces. And then we end the h1 tag. In this example, what's going to happen is that the user would see a header tag with the first name replaced by the value that came from the context. So they would see hello Johnny from our view. So there's some interesting aspects of this template processing. And the first aspect is that this can occur for any file type. Our example used an HTML file, but you could do this with text files. You could do this with XML files. You could do this with anything. You can make this. You could make custom markdown. It doesn't really matter. There's all sorts of ways you can use this for rendering. The other interesting aspect to make sure we observe is that the context dictionary is used as the source of data for all of the variables that are in the template. The keys in the context match the variable names that are available to the template. So that is what enabled the swapping out of a placeholder which is what those double curly braces represented, with an actual value. Right there is the dynamic combination of the static template content with the dynamic data from a dictionary. Now, our example used itself a static set because it was hard-coded to be Johnny, but you could imagine calculating context from some code and then feeding that into a template. If you remember back to a previous episode, we also talked about a template view, class-based view, and in that I had mentioned providing a template name, but I had glossed over totally this concept of context data because I had not introduced that yet, and I didn't want to confuse you. Now, if we revisit one of those examples where we had a template view in the past, there's more to this. If we want to add context to the template, there's a method that we need to extend in order to do that. So let's consider another example. This is application_views.py, and we're going to import the template view from django.views.generic.base. And we've got a class. I'm going to call this class hello view. It is a subclass of template view. It has a class level variable of template name, which is a string with hello.html as the value. The important part is this next bit, where we're going to create a method called getContextData, which will take self as the first argument, like any other method, and then star args and star keyword args as the second and third arguments. Within that method, we're going to call super, because this is a method that's coming from the super class. So we're going to call super on getContextData, pass in star args and star keyword args, and that will return a context variable. This context is the same context that we were talking about earlier, but it's coming from the superclass, so it has nothing in it yet. So we're going to extend that. That's a dictionary. So we're going to add to that dictionary first name using the bracket syntax of dictionary access and giving it a value of Johnny. And then we return all of that context. This, what I've just described, is the class-based view version of the function view that we described earlier. It's using the hello.html template. It's using a context dictionary with first name and Johnny. It's equivalent. It's a bit overkill for what we're describing here, but it is the method that you need to know if you're going to use template views and want to add context to them. In a lot of these examples that I'll be using today, the context that we're using is very synthetic. It's very fake. It's very small. It's very much meant to show off examples. In all of these examples, I would like you to think in your head to replace a dictionary with something big, something dynamically generated with a lot of content from other sources in the system. And we'll get to where a lot of those other sources of data come from in Django, from databases and how you would do that. But for today, we're going to just kind of wave our hands and say that the context is more involved than these examples are showing, and that will help you to start to see the power of how templates are actually used when they have a full set of context data. Next, let's talk about the core elements that go into a template. We have discussed variables very briefly, but there's more to variables than that. We have described that they are bounded by curly braces on either side, double curly braces, and that the value that is used in the template is a context variable that matches with a dictionary, but there's also ways to have more complex access. For example, if we have a nested dictionary and we want to access deeper information within our context, that's possible, and it's done using a dot notation. So if we have a context that looks like a dictionary with a key of address, and then within that value is another dictionary that has keys of street, city, state, zip code, and all of those have values that associate with some address within some place in the world, then how would you access address street, address city, address state, and so on? What you don't do is use a standard dictionary access notation in your template. That's not correct. It's not how Django intends to process things. So if you try to do double open curly brace, address, square bracket, string of street, close square bracket, close double curly brace, then that's not correct. Django's not going to like that. It's not how access is meant to happen in Django. Instead, Django gives you a nicer and simpler syntax. You can instead use double curly open address dot street double curly close. It has changed dictionary access from using its standard method to using a dot notation. That's very powerful and makes for much more readable templates. I provided an example of what this would look like in the show notes if you want to see more. Interestingly, this also works with objects in Django. So if you have an object of some kind and you pass that as part of your context dictionary, the dot access works the same. So if you had, let's say, an address object that had all of those same attributes that we referred to just a second ago, you could do exactly the same thing. So from the Django templates system's point of view, a dictionary or an object are very similar in their access patterns. There's another thing that we need to introduce in the template system, and that is tags. Tags exist in a curly brace % syntax rather than a double curly brace syntax. So you have open curly brace, %, some tag, %, close curly brace. And tags are functions that basically can be used to some level, and they represent all of the extra functionality that you might use to extend your templates to do more than just fill in variables and such. Let's look at a couple of core tags first, and then we'll dive into more even after that. So the first core tag that you will encounter is the trusty if statement. The if tag is used for handling conditional logic, as you might imagine, and it looks something like this. We start with an open curly brace and a %, followed by the word if, followed by user.isAuthenticated, and then % close curly brace. After that is an h1 heading tag with welcome and the variable open curly brace 2 times, user.username, close curly brace, and then closing h1 tag. And then finally, we end it with a open curly brace tag, % and end if as one word, and then % and close curly brace. So in this example, we're saying to the template system, only show this h1 tag if the user object within the context is authenticated, as in the isAuthenticated attribute evaluates to true. If it doesn't, then that entire h1 tag will be excluded from the output of the template. We also need to observe that this if tag required an endif tag. That's not very much like Python, if you think about it, and there's a good reason for that. Templates have to respect whitespace. Sometimes you need whitespace to matter. If you're using a text format, for example, and you're trying to, make a table or something like that, and you want the layout to match what you expect, then whitespace needs to be important. And because whitespace is important, we can't rely on whitespace like we do in normal Python programming as our way to denote scope. We have to use some other mechanism. And so the template system uses endif to signal to the system that the scope for that if block is finished. So a lot of tags that you'll encounter will have a matching closing tag. And the convention that seems to be used throughout Django's ecosystem is to have end followed by the tag name again. So that's why we had if and endif. The if tag also has some other things that can be used internally. So if you want to add an else tag as something in the middle of the previous example, you could do that. So that way that you can conditionally display one thing over the other. So from our previous fragment of HTML that we described, that was the user checking if they're is authenticated, we can add after that first h1 tag that we had earlier an else tag. And this is where it gets a little confusing describing this with audio. So as a reminder, there are show notes that show all of these examples because we're dealing with HTML tags and we're dealing with template tags. They are different things. So I apologize if it gets a little ambiguous, but I'll try my best. So we have an h1 HTML tag showing our welcome message earlier. And then we can have a template tag with open curly brace, %else, close curly brace, and then another h1 tag below that that has welcome guest if you're not authenticated. So it shows that we can conditionally choose one type of output over another. So that's the if tag. Another tag that you will absolutely need in almost all projects is a for loop tag. It's just the for tag is what you use in the syntax, and it looks like you would think it would look like. It looks very much like a standard Python for loop. So we have our opening tag like normal, the open curly brace and %, and we can do something like for item in items, and then %close curly brace, and then whatever template information we want to put in there, like a list item with a template variable of item.name, and we could say costs and item.price as another template variable, and close the list item tag HTML tag. And then we can end a for tag with open curly brace, %end for, close curly brace. The examples are challenging in this particular episode because we're dealing with a lot of extra markup, so I hope you can bear with me on describing some of these things. So in that for loop example, it can take context that is more than just a single variable. So your context that you would provide to the render call would be a list. And within that list, you could have objects or dictionaries that match the keys. So I said that my example had item and items. So you could have a Python list of items and dictionaries that have name and price and produce results that are fed from that dictionary of items. So it's a way to replicate output of template chunks by looping over them. Sometimes the for loop needs a little extra help. Maybe you need to do something on the first iteration through a loop. Maybe you need to do something on the last iteration of a loop. Something that is extra added to your context when you are inside of a for loop is a variable, interestingly called for loop, as in one word. So if you had an example of a for loop and you wanted to do some conditional logic on the last iteration, for instance, you could have an if tag with inside your for loop tag that said open curly brace %if for loop dot last %close curly brace, do something on the last iteration, open curly brace %end if close curly brace, and then that would be inside of your for loop. So that is a special thing that you will encounter not often, but it's good to know that there are things that you can do within your for loop that Django's keeping track of the bookkeeping. And this is useful because the enumerate option that you might otherwise try and use to do some of these things is not really available within the template system. Those are the two core tags that you will encounter everywhere in templates. Those two tags control most of your logical flow. They control your repetition element, so they're extremely useful things. Before we look at more different types of tags that are more specific in their purpose, let's switch gears for a moment. Let's talk a little bit more about context. We've briefly said that context is this dictionary that gets provided to render, but it's a bit more involved than that. It actually is a combination of dictionaries that kind of get merged together to produce a larger context that can provide more information to your template if you need to. So if you recall from the beginning of this episode, we talked about the setup, and I said that the options section of the setup includes something called context processors. So now's a good time to talk about what a context processor is. Context processor is a little bit of extra code that can add additional information that should be available to your template. Let's pick an example. You go back to that list of Start Project and you look at the show notes and you see that, or you run Start Project yourself within your own terminal at your desk, and find what the settings puts in there, you will encounter one context processor called Django.template.contextprocessors.request. What does this thing do? Well, this thing adds a request object to your context so that the request object becomes available to your template for any usage. So if you need to check something that's only available in the request, or maybe you want to check a header or check some other attribute that is hanging off of the request object, that would be a good way to go about it. And it's already there by default for you, so you can use it right away, which is pretty cool. But what is that request processor doing? Like, how is this system actually working? And we don't need to go too deep into the weeds of how it's working, but we can describe the interface that context processors use and understand how the template engine is going to bring them all together. The interface for a context processor is that it must be a function that takes a request object and returns some kind of dictionary. That's it. So with that example of the context processor for request itself, this one gets a little funny, but bear with me. If we look at the actual code, it's very short in the source code of the Django project. If you went to the Django project on GitHub and found within Django template context processors.py, you'll find this little function. Def request as the function name, request as the first input argument, return a dictionary of request as the key, and request as the value, which is tying together the input argument with the value in the dictionary. That's a lot of requests, and that's a little confusing, so look at the show notes to see it, because it's a function that has 6 words in it, and 4 of them are request, used in different ways, so I apologize for that. But that's it. That's all the context processor has to do to add the request to the template context. The template engine will then merge that dictionary into the other context, and so request will then become something that is available to you when you have that in your template. The downside of context processors that we need to be aware of, though, is that context processors run for all requests. So if you write something very poorly performing and you put it as a context processor, every request on your project will suffer that poor performance. So consider carefully where you put in context processors. Okay, let's come back to some tags that are interesting that have a different function within the template system. We need to talk about reuse. Templates by themselves are not reusable if you have just if and for loops. We need to find other mechanisms to make something reusable. And why would we want to do that? So let's think about a website. A website has web pages that you visit, different URLs that have different reviews that respond and provide different template responses in most circumstances. But a lot of the stuff that goes in a template is a very similar look and feel, which means that it's going to have most of the same HTML, which is the hypertext markup language that web pages use to define the structure of a page. It's also going to have CSS, cascading style sheets, which is how styles get defined for the elements in that structure. If we had to repeat all of that stuff on every page, it would be a huge pain in the rear. Let's consider 2 separate pages. This is an HTML page, and it starts with a doc type HTML tag, and that's to set it as HTML5. And then after that, we have an opening HTML tag, and then we have a head tag, and then we have a link tag that points to a styles.css file, and we close our head tag. We have a body tag with an h1 tag inside of that says hello from the home page, and then we close the body tag and we close the HTML. That's our entire HTML structure. It's a small, minimal HTML page. We could similarly have something that is exactly the same, that is just about a company's web about page, basically, that is all the same structure. The only difference being that the H1 tag within the body says learn about our company instead of hello from the homepage. Otherwise, these two templates are identical. This, as you might guess, is going to become a massive waste of time, because imagine you have, instead of 2 pages, 2,000 pages. And in that setup, imagine that you were asked as the developer to change from styles.css to better styles.css. Maybe a designer came in and improved everything, the look and feel of the site, and you've been tasked to go change out the files and you want a different file name for some reason. In that scenario, you're going to have this gargantuan amount of work of updating 1,000 files. And of course, you could write a little script that would dynamically go and update them all in one go. And, where there's lots of ways that programming can solve this problem, but this is not the most efficient way in a template system, because the template system provides you better tools to do this without duplicating all of this work. So to fix this problem, we're going to introduce a new template. We're going to call this template base.html. And it's going to be all of the same structure as I just described above. The doc type, the HTML tags, the header tags, body, everything. And the only difference is that inside of the body tag, I'm going to remove the h1 HTML tag and replace it with a template tag. The template tag is open curly brace %block, the word main, and then close curly brace. And then we need to have an end block tag. And that's it. We're going to leave it empty, the contents of this block tag. We have an opening tag and a closing tag, but there's nothing in it. Now we've made our first reusable template. This template works by defining a place that content can be inserted. So if we come back and fix up our previous two templates, our home template and our about template, we can change them to be the following. We'll just do the home one because it's illustrative of both. But if you change the home template and remove all of its previous content, and instead start at the very top with an extends tag, and the extends tag is going to take base.html as a string, then what we do after that is define another tag of block main, and inside of that block main, we're going to put the h1, that tag that we removed from our first version. This home template is now much smaller than it was before, and it actually doesn't look much like HTML anymore. It actually looks more like it's referencing a bunch of other Django stuff. It is pointing at the base HTML template, and it's saying that it extends that, and it is filling in the block main with the content that it wants to substitute. So now when the home template is rendered, it's going to do something different. It's going to look for base HTML as its starting point and going to fill in any blocks that it discovers, namely block main, with the content that it had. You can imagine that if all 2,000 web pages that are on your big version of your site were extending from base, then the problem of switching style sheets has suddenly gotten way easier. So now that we have this base HTML template that is got all of the core structure of our site, and the link tag, the HTML link tag that pointed to styles.css, is only in a single place. So if we needed to do that change of changing it to better styles and want to influence all of the pages that extends from base, we only have to make a single update. That is a powerful method of getting reuse out of a system by making things essentially extend from other templates. And it doesn't have to be a single level either. So if you had more customization, you can extend and extend and extend as you need to. Another powerful tag that we can use to get reuse out of a system is the include tag. The include tag is a substitution tag, essentially, where you can define a fragment of HTML or whatever template markup you're using and put it in a named file, and then have another template refer to that fragment by using the include tag. And this is useful if you ever get to a scenario where a template is getting super long. So maybe your website has grown a ton and your base HTML template that you've been using as the master template for all of the site, perhaps that is 20,000 lines long. You can decompose that into the parts so that if you change things to use include, you can separate those chunks into other places and make it more manageable. So I have an example where we've got our HTML page from earlier, but it looks a little different now. We still have the doc type of HTML to declare that it's HTML5, and we still use the HTML tag to open it up. But now instead of having a head tag, I've replaced it with an include template tag that uses head.html as the string. So we're moving all of the head content of the HTML structure into a head HTML file instead. Also, we have the body tag, and I'm imagining in my example that we now have site navigation, which has been added. So I've got an include template tag that points to a navigation.html template. So all of our navigation elements can be separated somewhere else. Then we can have a block main, just like we did before. So that goes to show that we can mix include and block. Those things can work together, and that's fine. And we close off our HTML body tag, and then we can include a footer, perhaps. So we've got a template tag of include with a footer.html that points to a footer.html file. So this is kind of contrived a little bit, I admit that, but I hope it gives you an idea of how a big file can be decomposed into smaller parts by using include. I think the nice part about doing this is that you name the pieces of your template and giving them something more meaningful. This is helpful context if you're ever asked to go update a certain portion of the site, like maybe you need to add new navigation to some new portion of your entire website, then you would know exactly where to go. It's going to be in navigation.html rather than guessing about what template it might reside in. So the block extends and include our core tags that help our user interface become manageable, helps keep it from sprawling all over the place and duplicating things all over the place. Let's talk about some built-in tags that are a little less core to this flow system of doing logic and doing reuse, but still are useful for various utility functions that are within the system. The Django documentation has a large list of built-ins that you can view. I've got a link to it in the show notes that you can go see, but there's a huge list of tags that cover all sorts of purposes, and we're going to do a brief tour of just a few of them because there are so many, and it's hard to pick your favorites, but there are tons that you will find valuable as you proceed in your Django projects. Top of the list, though, for me is something called the URL tag. You recall back to the episode on URLs, we talked about naming URLs and creating references. You could, in your template, point to a hard-coded string and have /home/ or something like that if you had an anchor tag. And that works for navigation. You could do that. But you're going to suffer from the same problem that I mentioned in the URLs article. Whereas if you ever move a view or move a URL to a new location, then the updating problem becomes something you'll have to face. And the mechanism for doing that in views was with a function called reverse that takes a named URL and does a lookup and provides back a string of reverse. The URL tag is the template equivalent of reverse. So instead of doing a view where you have a context and you're adding a reverse call into the context and then passing that on to render, you don't have to do that. You can use URL directly and it will have this behave exactly the same as reverse, but it will be done directly in your template. Nice convenience that you don't have to be shoving a bunch of URLs into your context every time you want to reference them. That's a useful tag, but there's another category of built-ins that we haven't talked about at all yet, and those are called filters. Filters are a way to act on template variables and change them, to modify the output that would otherwise come from calling, say, a stir operation on a variable, and sometimes you just want things to look a little differently. A filter looks like this. If I have a fragment of Django template and a variable with double curly brace open and the variable is called a variable, I can use a filter by putting a pipe character after a variable and then give it the filter name. So I'm going to call mine sum filter just for a moment. And if the sum filter takes arguments, you pass in the arguments by saying colon and then a string of whatever those arguments are. So admittedly, the filter syntax is a bit gnarly, but you get used to it after a while and it becomes, I won't say it ever becomes natural, but you at least understand what goes into it. The most important element of a filter is that pipe character. Not every filter takes arguments, so when you want to use a filter, you know that you pass a pipe character after a variable name in a template, and that starts a filter declaration. The other thing to note is that these are not used on tags, they're used on variables. So we're not talking about in the context of curly brace %. This is purely within double curly braces. The filter that I think I use the most is probably the date filter. When you pass a Python datetime instance into the context, you're going to get some default formatting of it. I can't remember what it is exactly off the top of my head, but it's something long and probably not what you want. The date filter is a way to make it into what you want. Date documentation includes a lot of options that you can use to specify the format, and these specifiers dictate what a datetime will come out looking like on the other side. So if we have an example of a template variable, and I'll just call it a datetime, and we use a pipe, we say date, colon, and then the string is where we provide the format specifiers. If I have a string with the format specifiers of capital Y, dash, lowercase m, dash, lowercase d, then my datetime example would look something like 2020-04-08. So that is how you can take a datetime and produce whatever format you want out of it. And there are so many specifiers. You can look at the list that just about any format you could imagine is producible in that list within reason. Another useful filter is the default filter. So if you have a variable that evaluates to false, that includes empty string, by the way, then you can use the default filter to substitute whatever kind of text you might want. So if we have a fragment of the template variable called a variable with a pipe, and then the default filter, and colon, and then a string of nothing to see here, if a variable was false, then the template will produce nothing to see here. That's pretty handy. One that I really enjoy for times where you need to deal with user data, and we're going to deal with user data a lot in the next episode when we talk about forms, is when you're dealing with a text area where the user is allowed to provide new line characters. They want enters in there. There is a filter called line breaks that can replace new line characters with break tags. So if you know HTML well enough, you know that new line characters by default do not appear in HTML output. If you want to have a what amounts to a new line, then you need a break tag to signal to HTML that the element is breaking there. So the line breaks filter changes new line characters to break tags so that what a user might input as new lines will actually appear as something that they expect on the other side. Another useful filter is the pluralize. The pluralize filter is for pluralizing things. And it's a convenience that considers the scenario when you have a list or a count of some amount and you need text that matches that pluralization. So let's say you have a context variable called count items. It's just a number, and your fragment is a template variable of count items, and then the literal of item, and then immediately following item is another template variable with count items again, and a pipe and pluralize as the filter. So this example, what it will do is do the right thing depending on the count number. So if you had a 0 as your count items value, it would say 0 items. If you had 1, it would do the right thing and use the singular and say 1 item. 2, 2 items. 3, 3 items. And I think you get the idea. It's just a useful technique for making sure that counts display properly, and it's got some options for even if you have words that have different kinds of plural endings like es instead of s, it can handle that too. Another final filter to consider before we move on is the yes/no filter. This is a good one for dealing with scenarios where you have a Boolean that is either true or false, or can deal with the optional case of none as well. Imagine that we have a Boolean that represents whether someone has accepted or declined or not RSVP'd to an event. And the Boolean states of true and false are the accepted and declined, and a state of none is no response yet. So we could have a template fragment that says a template variable of user.name, and then after the variable has, and then within another variable, user accepted, pipe, yes, no, colon, and then 3 arguments. Arguments in filters are separated by commas. So we could say accepted, comma, declined, comma, not RSVP'd, and then close the string and close the template variable. So in this context, that user accepted Boolean, by passing it to the yes/no filter, will display something that's actually meaningful for the user. What happens though when you have a template problem that doesn't fit into one of the built-ins? What can you do? Thankfully, Django has you covered. They've got a system that helps you make custom tags and custom filters when you need to. Let's briefly outline, this is a bit of an advanced topic, so let's briefly outline the elements to it and then declare victory. So when you have a custom tag, there are a few things that Django expects. The custom tag has to be defined in the right spot. It has to be registered with the template engine, and then it also has to be loaded and used by a tag. So the right spot is within an application, you need a directory called template tags. There's no underscore between it. It's all jammed together, template tags. That needs to be a Python package. So that means you need a init, a double underscore init, double underscore .py file to make that a package. Also, within that template tags directory, you need to create another file, a Python module. And this is going to be the name that gets loaded and registered with the template system. So choose a meaningful name for this module because it's what you will actually use in your templates. So in an example, I've got custom tags.py as my module. The next thing to do is actually create a custom tag. In application, template tags, custom tags.py, we've got something like the following. We're going to import random from the standard library, and we're also going to import template from the Django package. And after that, at module level scope, we're going to create a variable called register, and it's going to be coming from template.library. And library is like a class variable, or it looks like a class. So it looks like you're instantiating a class. And then we create our filter. We're going to start with a filter example. The filter is a function, and my filter I'm calling add pizzazz, which will take a value. And within my function, I've got a variable called pieces of flair. It's a list. It's a list of strings that have things like amazing, wowza, unbelievable. And finally, we're going to return value plus random.choice pieces of flair. To the top of that function, though, we need to add something. We need to add a decorator of @register.filter. That's an important element. So what we've done is create a custom filter, and we have registered it with the template system. If we want to use this filter, then in a template, we would need to use a load tag. The load tag tells us which set of custom tags do we want to add. So our template is going to look like this. It's going to have a load tag, so open curly brace, %load custom tags, %close curly brace. If we assume that the template is receiving a message variable as context, we could have a message template variable which receives a filter of add pizzazz. So message pipe add pizzazz. If our message was you got a perfect score, then the template would show some random extension onto that, like you got a perfect score, wowza. So this is a bit of a silly example, of course, but it's meant to show that you can make a custom tag with logic, and it worked by setting the module in the right package structure, registering that filter with the template library, and then using it by loading in the custom tags in the template where you want to use it. If we want to make a custom tag that is actually a tag instead of a filter, it's an extremely similar process. So all of the same things apply, except instead of using the decorator of @register.filter, we would use @register.simpleTag. There are other tag types that we could use, but we're going to stick with simpleTag because we don't need to go too deep down the customization path. And if we wanted to use it, we can use it in a similar way. So imagine that I created a custom tag called champion welcome. And in that welcome tag, it will respond based on what the name of the person is and what level that person is, let's say. Like we're making something for a video game. And depending on if you're a high level, you get a good greeting. And if you're a low level, you get recognized as not someone very important. So in my template example, we can just imagine that this champion welcome exists. The full implementation is in the show notes if you want to look at it. But we can have load custom tags, just like we did before with the filter. And then now we're going to use a tag syntax. So open curly brace, %. We're going to say champion welcome. And then our hero's name is going to be He-Man, and He-Man's level is 50. And if you look at the implementation, that's like the best case because He-Man's awesome. And it says, hello, great champion He-Man. So, just some kind of fun example. And the purpose of that example is to show that by using a tag, you can accept multiple variables that are provided. And those could be context variables, those could be static things that you provide your template, whatever you need to do. The custom tag can accept either. So that's how you do some custom tagging. There's a lot more to custom tagging that like I said, we're not going to dive into. The Django documentation for this is really good, really extensive. I have a link to it in the show notes. So now we've seen templates in action. We've looked at how to set up templates for your site. We have looked at ways to call templates from your views using render. We talked about template variables and data and access patterns that you get used for more complex data. We've discussed logic and doing if statements and for statements. We've looked at built-in tags and filters that are available to templates, including block, include, extends, all of the examples that do extra custom things for you that are really nice. And we talked about customizing the templates with your own set of tags and how you would go about doing that. I think that brings us to the conclusion of our tour of templates. In the next episode, we're going to focus on forms. Forms are the way that users interact with us, with the way that users provide data to a website, and we'll see how Django makes it possible to generate forms quickly so that users can interact with the site and help us do it efficiently and safely, validating data and everything that goes into handling forms so that users get the appropriate feedback that they need. Full show notes for this episode are available at www.mattlehman.com/DjangoRiffs/4. Thanks for listening to this episode of Django Riffs. You can follow the show at djangoriffs.com. If you have something to share, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is mblehman, or follow the Django Riffs handle to keep up with the show. If you've enjoyed the show, please rate or review on iTunes, Spotify, or from wherever you listen to podcasts. Your rating will help others discover the podcast, and I would be very grateful. Django Riffs is supported by listeners like you. If you can contribute financially to cover hosting and production costs, please check out my Patreon page at www.patreon.com/mblehman. The theme music for Django Riffs is Open Roads, used with permission from Purple Planet Music. I hope you'll join us next time to learn more about Django. Take care.